Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. John Douillard, and welcome to the LifeSpa podcast, where we prove the ancient medical wisdom of Ayurveda with modern science. And today we have a really special podcast. It's going to be all about cancer survivorship, Ayurvedic medicine, and much, much more. Our special guest is Dr. Sam Watts. He's a PhD researcher on cancer. He's written this book called The Ayurvedic Approach to Cancer. A really amazing book, I must say, that if you have cancer or you know of anyone else who has cancer, they really need to read this particular book because it goes into all of the cutting edge science on cancer prevention, cancer survivorship. Dr. Sam Watts got his PhD at the University of Southampton School of Medicine in the UK. He's also received a National Institute of Health Research Award, the Young Researcher of the Year for prostate cancer. He's a wealth of knowledge. You're not going to want to miss this podcast. It's a little bit longer than our usual ones, but we dove into some really great detail. Sam, welcome. It's so great to have you here. You wrote this book, The Ayurvedic Approach to Cancer, an amazing book. I couldn't put it down. It was interesting. While I was reading this book, my wife was called away to go be with a friend, a real dear friend who was very young and dying of cancer. So while my wife was away for 4 days, I was just engrossed in this book about cancer. So it was sort of a serendipitous experience for me. Unfortunately, she did pass away, but there's so much great information in this book. I just can't wait to dive into it. I kind of want to start out with this whole idea, the Ayurvedic approach to cancer. What is the I know there's a whole book about it, but I want to start with sort of the Candace Pert-esque kind of quantum understanding of, the Ayurvedic approach to cancer, and can dive in and go from there. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, that's the crux of the issue. And I think it's the topic that is perhaps most exciting and most empowering, particularly if you're living with cancer, or supporting someone who is, because I think for me, in writing the Ayurvedic approach to cancer, the foundation was all about the power of consciousness and the power of the mind, and the quantum physics model, and how, in my experience of working with exceptional cancer patients, the variable that is most predictive of their ability to become exceptional, this clinical term ECAPS, exceptional cancer patients. These are people that have an incurable terminal prognosis. They've completely given up on, they have no hope of surviving, and yet they do that. They go on to survive 5, 10, 15 years, and they're not common, but they're not rare either. And if we can understand the commonalities that these people do, that, hopefully we can then provide a framework for how we can help other people become exceptional. And the reason the book started with the neuropeptide work and the mind body medicine work and the quantum physics work is that is, on the weight of the evidence and my own experience working with these people, absolutely the most powerful predictor of what allows someone to become exceptional. And what's so fascinating is how, in many ways, there's a beautiful synergy between the very ancient Ayurvedic understanding of how cancer is perceived in the body, and how some of the most paradigm changing research to come out of medicine in the last 30 or 40 years, how that supports that in this neuropeptide model, and how every single cell in the body is ultimately secreting the molecules of emotion that we are generating in our mind. And the implications of that on cancer cell biology, and particularly the immune cancer paradigm, is absolutely profound. And I think it's something that, if we're living with cancer, it's not to say that it can cure cancer. It's obviously much more complex than that. But I think it's whenever people reach out to me, or I'm working with people who are living with cancer, and they say, where do I start? That for me is always where we start. It has to be where we start, because I think we could be radicalizing our diet. We could be using the best of conventional medicines, the best of herbal medicines. We could be doing all of the survivorship practices, but ultimately, if our subconscious doesn't truly subscribe to our ability to overcome this challenge, I think there's a much lower ceiling on what we can achieve and what becomes possible. And there's very clear clinical research to support that view. So I think that's why I wanted to start with that topic in the book, because I think it is the foundational mechanism.
Yeah, I want everyone to know that what I really love about Sam's approach here is that it's really science based. And when I first saw the title, The Ayurvedic Approach to Cancer, I sort of did admittedly roll my eyes a little bit. Like, okay, what's this going to, because I get so many books about people writing books on Ayurveda. And generally speaking, there's zero science in any of those books, which are fine because there's, some of the principles in Ayurveda aren't really backed by science. But it's sort of my area. What I do is write articles about ancient wisdom and modern science. And what I love about what you did is you on both fronts, on the kind of the quantum self-spontaneous healing side, and also on the herbal and lifestyle side, there was science to back it up. So I want everybody to know this book is really, if you know anybody with cancer or have cancer, this is a book that everybody should read. We're going to dive into this in detail. Now, Candace Pert, when I came back from India in 1986, I co-directed Deepak Chopra Center, which was when he had just written Quantum Healing, which was sort of, so we had basically a cancer institute for Ayurveda. And what was really interesting was the folks that actually did really well were the ones who probably did a little bit of both Western medicine and Ayurveda. But the thing that was the common denominator that I saw, I was there for 8 years, was that the ones who really did well, they're the ones who said, this was the best thing that ever happened to me. This diagnosis changed my life. And I just completely did a 180 and my life changed. Candace Pert came to our clinic there and I got to meet her and work with her, which was phenomenal.
Wow.
And yeah, it was crazy. And so when you wrote a little bit about her, it was so nice to see her name in your book. Let's talk about what her research really did to kind of change the game in your book, but particularly with cancer research and such.
Yeah, you're so right. I'd love to have met her in person. I mean, what an amazing thing to have done because she and I, her book, A Molecules of Emotion, I think is mandatory reading for anyone living, or actually any health crisis, or even if you're trying to prevent a health crisis. And it. I think the term paradigm change is used quite loosely now. I think because of the world of social media and everyone trying to put something out there. But I think what she propagated and what her research generated truly was a paradigm change, wasn't it? In that what she ultimately did was provide a robust, scientifically valid mechanism for mind-body medicine and mind-body healing, and showing how our belief system and the consciousness model and our outlook and our attitudes and beliefs and our expectations, perhaps more than anything else, how they are directly correlated to clinical outcomes. And it seems like the more challenging the health crisis, the more powerful this model becomes. And when living with cancer, I think this is why perhaps the peptide work and Candace Pert's work is perhaps more powerful and more relevant in the arena of cancer than maybe other arenas, is because I think cancer is probably the most universally feared disease. There's been some fascinating, there was a great study done in London where they essentially handed out £5 notes on one of the busiest streets in London, asking people a series of questionnaires, and they were told, Alzheimer's is harder to manage than cancer. Heart disease kills more people than cancer. And then we have cancer. Which disease would you most like to avoid? And 93% of the people said above anything else, I would choose to avoid cancer. And I think there's a huge indoctrination, a cultural view of cancer as being this horrifically terrifying, rampant turning of the body against itself. And cancer is dangerous, cancer is scary, but there's definitely a sense that cultural perspective of cancer, I think, changes the way that we approach it and the way we view it when we are living with it or supporting someone who is. So the reason that ties in so powerfully with Candace Pert's work is that she provided a framework for what that kind of belief system, how it generates change, because she ultimately showed, every cell in the body, what her work showed was every cell in the body is capable of secreting these molecules of emotion. And this idea that if we are feeling helpless and hopeless and disempowered and pessimistic, yes, that's a behavioral and psychological and emotional response, but every cell in the body, particularly our immune cells, are secreting molecules that are expressing the same emotions. And what is an immune system that is feeling helpless, hopeless, and disempowered? How does that behave? It becomes quite significantly suppressed. So, at the exact time in our life when we need our body and our immune system to be working as robustly as it possibly can in the face of cancer, it's actually being suppressed. Whereas the opposite is also true, that when we, particularly when we receive a diagnosis of cancer and someone looks you in the eyes, particularly if it's the prognosis isn't great, and the consultant says, well, I'm sorry, Mr. Bloggs, the results are back, and the prognosis is that this is incurable. The most we can do is palliative, and you've statistically got 15 months to live. If you have the ability to look that person back in the eyes and say, well, I appreciate your perspective and I appreciate your statistics and your experience, but I choose my own reality. And that reality is that in 10, 15 years, I'm going to be here, and I'm going to be here in good health, and I'm going to move mountains to make that possible. That attitude of empowerment and hope and hopefulness, yes, that makes our quality of life better. But again, what do we know? Our immune cells specifically secrete these molecules, these peptides that say, okay, well, there is hope here, there is possibility here, in my mind, there is the ability to survive this, to overcome this. And what we know is that when our immune cells, or all cells, but particularly our immune cells, secrete these molecules of emotions, their functionality becomes much more powerful, particularly in terms of immunity, immune status within the tumor microenvironment. So at the time when we need our immune system to be working absolutely optimally, we've helped cultivate that. We've engineered that through our outlook. And some people are better at this and some people are worse at this, but everyone can learn it. This is a learnt skill. And I've never genuinely, with all sincerity, worked with anyone living with cancer, particularly if it's has an incurable prognosis, who hasn't been able to learn the skills and cultivate this kind of outlook. So this shouldn't be viewed as an outlier or an optional extra. I think this should be viewed as an absolute foundation of, when we're living with cancer, we have to get this lined up first. We have to make sure that our most powerful anti-cancer actions in our body, our immunity, is absolutely working in the most efficiently anti-cancer way we can. And yes, diet is going to support that, and herbs are going to support that, but they're always going to be secondary to the messages that they're secreting themselves. And those messages come from the belief system we cultivate. And I think there was an American author, I think he was American or Canadian, called Lawrence Lashan, who wrote, he was a psycho-oncologist, and he wrote some brilliant books about psychology of survivorship in cancer. And he said something that's subtle but profound. He said there's a big difference between wanting to live and not wanting to die. And I think that always struck me as being really significant, because some of the practices that can help change those biochemical and peptide models is that absolutely profound sense of why I want to live, what things set me alight, what are my passions, my goals, my dreams, what are the things that make me want to jump out of bed in the morning and seize this day, as opposed to ruminating on why I don't want to die. And they're subtly different, but in terms of the messages and the subconscious and the hormonal responses to that and the biochemical responses to that, it's a huge gulf. And it's so powerfully predictive of healing in all contexts, but it does seem to have more of an affinity for anti-cancer pathways.
So you're talking about a positive attitude. I imagine that's on the top of the list, but how about happiness or joy, or getting kind of a little bit of euphoria from a cup of coffee or some cacao, or these kind of things, do they have the same effect where you can kind of, or telling jokes or laughter, or does, how does all that relate to, the positive outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think those kind of more transient things that bring happiness, they're important because that elevates quality of life, which will, positively impact upon all kinds of variables. But this work is looking more often at more deep-seated motivations, really deep drivers of what make me me, who is Joe Bloggs, who is this person? And a great example I've got, which is a true example of how powerful this model can be. I was working with a guy in his early 60s who had metastatic prostate cancer. And when I started, I met him at a survivorship course I was running at Crawley Hospital in England. And at that point, he was about 6 months past his best prognosis, but he was a very famous European champion of vegetable growing. He was a competitive vegetable grower. And he'd won awards for the biggest tomato and this, that, and the other. But the one award he'd never won, which was it was a passion for him, was to win the biggest marrow. It was like a 36-inch marrow or something ridiculous. And I remember him looking me in the eyes and saying, I refuse to die. I refuse to succumb to this illness until I have grown this 36-inch marrow or whatever it was. And that was such an overwhelming driver for him. That was his identity. His identity, his whole life, he'd been a competitive vegetable grower. And his wife used to laugh with me and say that every autumn, when he hadn't achieved that goal, she would breathe a sigh of relief because she knew he probably had another year, another growing season. And why that struck me as being significant, this wasn't climbing Mount Everest, it wasn't sailing around the world. It was something that on the surface to other people might look a little bit silly or perhaps not that significant. It's never going to win the Nobel Prize for this. But the attachment that he placed onto that goal was so powerful, so overwhelming that in his mind, it wasn't the only thing that was responsible for why he became an ECAP, an exceptional cancer patient, but he put it as being the most powerful one because it gave him a reason for every morning getting up, for adopting all of the practices that kept him healthy and for wanting to live. So I think the smaller things like the beautiful cup of coffee in the sun, a lovely dog walk, reading a great book, these things are all incredibly important because they make us happy, and happiness is healing. But below that more transient happiness, we need that deep driving, burning passion for something, whether it's a family member, whether it's a goal, whether it's art, music. And there's some beautiful Western research coming out around this, isn't there? The topic of Hikigai, this Japanese term for why I get up in the morning. One of the lifestyle practices that are most correlated to reaching 100 years of age, becoming a centenarian. What is Hikigai? It's why I get up in the morning. That's exactly the same thing. It's what makes me me, the I maker, what makes this individual person that person. And when we connect with that, when we truly connect with that dharma, that purpose, I think it mobilizes healing mechanisms that perhaps we haven't even fully understood yet. And I think that's just as important for preventing illness, and it's just as important for living a fully lived life. I think everyone, whenever you meet someone who has that sense of dharma, that sense of why I'm here, what role I'm fulfilling, they often look brighter. Their eyes and they exude this life energy. And I think it's one of the highest goals to aim towards in life because it's why we're here. And I think in the context of healing, in context of the neuropeptides and survivorship, particularly exceptional survivorship, I think it really does mobilize mechanisms that are of such importance. So we want these multi layers of happiness. We want the simpler things, but we need it built upon this deep foundation of this is who I am.
Okay, just so everybody remembers, we're talking to Dr. Sam Watts. He's a PhD cancer researcher. And Sam, we talked a little bit about Candace Pert's molecules of emotion. And there's an Ayurvedic correlate there as well, where she talked about how these molecules, these neuropeptides, carry emotion. They interact with all the cells in your body, your immune system, your nervous system. But they also can be stored in different parts of your body and your muscle and your tissues. And in Ayurvedic medicine, we actually call that something, as you know, something called ama, where these molecules of emotion, mental ama in particular, can be stored in your fat and your muscles. And to get access to those stored emotions, we have to facilitate the body's ability to burn fat, which is a non-emergency fuel. When you're under stress, the body takes the fat, puts it under the mattress, and saves it for a rainy day, along with reserve fuel and fat for insulation. We also store these neuropeptides, these molecules of emotion. So a big part of Ayurveda, and what you're talking about is to access a deeper level of self-awareness so you can recognize, when you burn the fat is on the screen. You can see patterns of behavior that you've been engaged in your entire life that maybe served you when you were a child, but clearly are not serving you today as an adult. So what are the ways that we can actually get those molecules of motion to be released so we can have a level of self-awareness, so we can actually see the opportunity to take transformational change and free us? Because like that guy, he had that, I don't know what a marrow is, like a melon or something. Is that what it is?
Yeah, a courgette, a big courgette.
Oh, like a zucchini. That's a
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, right. That's what we call it. So yeah, that's huge, zucchini then.
yeah. Okay, it was a European record.
Okay. But the idea is that was his motivation to get up and go, and somehow, what are the ways that people can actually say, okay, I need to apply this tool to get myself to be more self-aware, to break those patterns of behavior that are holding me onto these emotional patterns that are making me feel less than optimal.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I think there's multiple prongs to that, aren't there? But I think what you were speaking about with the fat side is fascinating, because obviously Ayurveda places such emphasis on ama as a clinical target, and detoxification. The Ayurvedic practices for detoxification are so powerful and so effective, and that side of things, that more physiologically driven detoxification pathways and mechanisms are so important. But I think above that comes that awareness. I think in our world, so few people are truly self-aware of who they are and what they want out of life. And that transition from education to work to marriage to children to retirement, we're almost running through, a lot of people running through life in a programmed way, without bringing that sense of awareness to actually, who am I? What truly, if I could craft and cultivate an ideal life for myself, what does that look like? Because as soon as we bring that self-awareness to things, suddenly we're looking at objective facts through more of a subjective lens. And that subjectivity obviously brings increased awareness. And with that increased awareness, we can make better choices. And then with better choices, we always get better outcomes. And armor, this idea of armor, I think lots of the Western textbooks and the like always seem to correlate it as a physiological toxin, something that is accumulating in the body and in the fat, dysbiosis, whatever we want to call it. But Ayurveda also talks a lot about mental armor, does it? Like you said, this psychological and emotional toxicity or armor. And how do we break through that? We break through it by essentially detoxifying the psychological and emotional pathways. And that's where you see the two align. So practices like meditation, practices like pranayama, particularly pranayama, I think is profoundly effective for opening up that consciousness and increasing that awareness. Nature immersion, forest bathing, all of these things that force or not force, but I think trigger the conscious and the subconscious self into a more introspective, reflective, awareness generating outlook of who I am and where I sit in life and what things are truly important to me. And I think when these things are all aligned, you do often get a breakthrough moment. I've spoken to, like you said at the start, John, you said people with cancer will often say 5, 10, 15 years down the line that I wouldn't wish it on myself, but having gone through it, it's one of the best things that ever happened to me. And so many people with cancer say that. And I think the reason for that is that it was the motivation, the prompt to take a long, hard look at their life and say, right, I now have to use this as a catalyst for becoming the very best version of myself. And that requires changing those habitual emotional responses and reactions, and changing the way we engage with ourselves, our loved ones, our life, our family, our work. And that ultimately all comes down to awareness. Yes, there is the physiological side and the physical side, and that is really important. But for me, it still comes back to that psychological side, that consciousness side, and the awareness that comes with that. And that's why practices like pranayama, like meditation, like yoga are so, on multiple levels, so important and so healing, because they're working on the physical, they're working on the psychological, the subconscious, the immunological pathways. They're working on in so many different ways, and they're all different approaches to the same end goal, which in this context is obviously healing in the face of cancer.
You mentioned in your book a study that showed that 70% of the cancer patients 12 months prior to the actual diagnosis had some significant life stress that seemed to be the catalyst for perhaps developing, the cancer. There's study after study after study that shows that stress, this this underlying, all this incoming information in our culture compared to our ancestors who, when you think about just going for a walk in the forest, it's very still, it's very quiet. You're actually, being bombarded by a completely different aromatic microbiome that you're breathing in from the air. There's neurochemicals from the trees. There's bugs from the trees that you're breathing in. There's a blasting of red light that's bouncing off the ground and off the trees. So you're actually literally getting bombarded in infrared light, which has been powerfully known to be anti-inflammatory and a deficiency that we all have today more than ever. So the idea of meditation always seemed to me like a biohack for cultures that came from tribal areas and they migrated into civilization, some sort of a civilization, culture, cities. And people who were smart enough realized that this city life, even way back when, was pretty hectic compared to the tribal life, where they were living completely in line and harmony with the laws of nature. Come into the city, people are stealing and lying and cheating, like bad things happen. So they figured, what if we meditated, we kind of replicate that silence of nature, And I think that's a takeaway that I think is so critically important. Like this morning, finally the sun rise was now, because the sun's moving like crazy in the spring, right? We're finally at a place where we can actually see the sunrise, because it moves so dramatically. And so I was out there this morning meditating with the sunrise, and it just constantly reminds me of the idea that silence of the morning time is kind of a resetting your biological clocks that this is the start of the day, but it's also a turning on of the biological clocks, but it's also a recognition of the silence and then carrying that silence with you throughout the day. And that's something that meditation does. And people don't realize, I just wrote an article about metabolic syndrome, right? Which is all these metabolic problems, cholesterol, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, extra weight around your belly, all these things that are really linked to heart disease and cancers and inflammation and all that. And they have all these tools, medications and statins, should I not? But when you actually look at the research, you find that the one thing that actually causes every one of those conditions, insulin resistance, leptin resistance, you name it, weight gain, is stress.
Yeah.
And it's just culture. So I think if people were to and what you're saying is like if people could just meditate, yoga, breathe, meditate, and still their nervous system once or twice a day, align yourself with the silence of nature, and then try to carry that silence with you into your day, then you become the eye of the storm, not the winds of the storm, And I think that's the big problem in our culture, is that we're all living in the winds of the storm, dodging refrigerators and crazy stuff, all the stress in life, and then we come home and have a glass of wine to relax and just chill out, and and then eat a big dinner and fall asleep on the couch. It's this terrible way to live life.
Yeah.
No, never been done before. So I want you to expand on, these tools that people can take away and go, wait a minute, there's a lot of logic, and maybe we could dive into, the story you mentioned about Roger Bannister and some of the imagery, because these mindsets that we have, one other study that I'll just remind you of is that one study, many of them show that 95% of the things we think and say and do as adults come from impressions from the first 5 years of life. And you mentioned in your book about becoming conscious of consciousness. Ayurveda said we are unconscious human beings. What we're doing 95% of the time is unconscious, because they're based on 95% of it. It's all based on, our childlike impressions. And we have to become conscious. And what you're talking about in your book is way after way after way to become conscious, and not only cure cancer in many cases, but to really live a much more fulfilling life. So it's really, I think, a book for anyone, for everyone, really. Preventatively. Nobody wants to get that C word, right?
Mm. Yeah, and I think, going back a bit to what you were speaking about, that intelligence of nature, one of my old professors at the hospital, he used to speak a lot about this term called the Paleolithic Problem. And it's a beautiful concept which is based upon the idea that about 90% of our genome is the same as what it was in the Paleolithic era when Homo sapiens first emerged from Homo erectus in Tanzania about 200,000 years ago. 90% of the genes that are controlling us now are the same as what they were then. But look at the disparity between how we're living now compared to how we were living then. Back then in sub-Saharan Africa, we were completely aligned with nature. We woke with the sun. We only ever ate in daylight hours. We were always had the support of the tribe and the community. We went to bed with the sun. We slept properly. No no digitalization, no blue screens, no artificial stimulation. It was almost like a walking meditation. They've done research on the Hansa tribe, which are probably the most authentic hunter-gatherers alive today, and they've just the anthropologists have described these people as existing in a state of walking consciousness, walking meditation. Their whole outlook is constantly aligned with where they are right now. Their whole they to exist in the way they live, they need to be conscious all of the time, and they are living such a pure lifestyle. And they speak about this idea of carrying stillness in them. They talk about carry every morning waking up and carrying the stillness of the night into the day so that they remain centered and calm. And I 100% subscribe to what you just said, which was this overwhelming stimulation that we're getting from the moment we wake up. The number of people I know, they wake up and the first thing they do is reach for their phone, and you're instantly on social media or on the news and things like this, and you're being stimulated within 60 seconds of becoming conscious, waking up. Our brain is being dopamine hit again and again and again, and it's so unnatural, and it just means we're essentially in a the chronicity of the stress response is pretty much the entirety of our waking state until maybe we get onto the sofa in the evening with a glass of wine and we chill out and then we go to bed. But that's quite maladaptive coping. It's not great. And I think that accumulative chronicity of stress, I think, is responsible for so much dissatisfaction with life, so much illness, particularly the chronic diseases. So that idea of being in the eye of the storm rather than in the winds of it, I think, is a beautiful, almost aid memoir to try and cultivate that stillness as we go through the day, because I do think it's integral. And there are lots of practices that we can do to facilitate that, and I think maintaining circadian alignment, and I'm digressing a little bit from your question, but I think it's important to touch upon it because we know from the research that somewhere between 60 and 70% of working age adults are living in a state of chronic circadian misalignment. And that, to me, that's something that keeps me awake at night, because I do genuinely feel that it could be one of the public health time bombs that is ticking very fast. And I think maybe the implications of it won't be known until it's too late, because if circadian alignment, the circadian clock, is regulating every single one of the 50, 60 trillion cells in our body, there's no gray area. We're either circadian aligned and the cells are working in harmony, or they're not. There's not really anything in between. And it's so easy in our world, in the Western world, the developed world, it's easier to be out of circadian alignment than it is in it, because everything we do, from when we eat to when we get up, to our exposure to UVA, UVB in the morning, to heavy curtains and blinds that stop sunlight coming in, going to bed too late, all of these things that every day put us out of circadian alignment. And the implications on things like Alzheimer's and heart disease are clear, but the implications on cancer is overwhelmingly important. And we know that cancer cells have a circadian clock. It's one of the breakthrough studies in cancer medicine in the last 10 years, is the identification that almost 100%, there's some question marks about certain brain cancers, but other than that, generally speaking, every cancer cell has a circadian clock. And when that cancer cell is working in circadian alignment, it is now been proven to extend lifespan in certain cancer types compared to people with the same cancer whose cancer cells aren't in circadian alignment. So there's a direct survivorship response, an increase in longevity when we are living a lifestyle that generates circadian alignment, not just in our healthy cells, but particularly in our cancerous cells. And whether we're looking at this through the lens of cancer prevention, whether we're looking at it in terms of cancer management, maintaining circadian alignment is not, it's mandatory. It's something that has to be done. And I think Ayurveda has such a beautiful framework for helping people engineer that and sustain that in a pretty easy way. I think if we look at Dinacharya and the Ayurvedic daily routine, it's essentially an ancient framework for what Western science is telling us. So making sure we are waking up at the right time, making sure we are exposing our eyes to that first 90 minutes of sunlight, because that's obviously what triggers the circadian clock for the next 24 hours. All of these kinds of things, they sound almost a little bit phony or a little bit weak on the outside when you're living with cancer. But if you actually dive into the research and you look at what happens to the way healthy cells and cancer cells behave, it's a healing mechanism that so few people take advantage of. But in reality, it's a healing mechanism that we absolutely, without exception, need to be mobilizing. So this idea of us being part of nature, and this idea that the more we separate ourselves from nature, generally speaking, the sicker and less healthy and less happy we're going to become. Yes, all of the indigenous and traditional systems of medicine talk about this, but it is backed up by some pretty compelling Western research, isn't it?
Oh, there's so much. I mean, I feel like, I've been in practice, sounds hard to believe, but for 41 years now. And I feel like the first 20 of those years, I would just tell people when to eat lunch, and, when to go to bed. It's just the simple, basic things. And they did a couple of studies here at CU Boulder. And they took a bunch of healthy Boulder people, supposed to be a healthy environment here, and they were all unhealthy. They took their circadian rhythms. They were producing melatonin in the middle of the day and cortisol at night, and they were a mess. So they took them all into the mountains, no sun, no electricity, in bed with the sun, up with the sun. And in 1 week of being off the grid, 1 week, they reset their circadian biological clocks and nature's rhythms by 100%. They took another group, same disruption. They took them for a weekend and reset their biological clocks 69%. And there was a kind of a landmark study, you probably know it too, is when they took a group of Americans, shipped them to Israel, and then had them come right back on the same flight, right? And when they measured their bugs, when they came back, they were healthy when they left. When they came back, their bugs had already shifted to be more diabetic and obese in terms of the microbes in their gut. They took those bugs, put them into healthy mice, which was sort of sad. And in short order, those mice started eating during the day and having more proliferation of bugs that were more linked to diabetes and obesity. So, just one flight crossing time zones, we have no idea the impact. So I think what you're saying is something that, and of course, there are things that we can do to mitigate that. You don't need to live in a bubble, but I think if you do the things like the meditate, the yoga, the breathe, keep reinstating that silence, that eye of the storm. This is what, one of the classic Vedic texts, which is the Bhagavad Gita. The whole point of that book is, basically, my opinion, is to establish being and perform action. In other words, first if you're going to pull back a bow, first you have to hold it really still. If you're moving the bowstring and shoot it, you're never going to find the arrow. But if you pull it back and establish being, become still in your nervous system, and then take action, it's transformational. That was the whole point. Just like you said, these Hadza tribe members would take the silence of the night and the silence of that morning stillness and take it with them into the day. I love that. That's the whole point of what I think. If people can just say, oh, that's the visualization that I want to carry into my life. I want to, and we even teach like a 1-minute meditation to reset that, so people can actually just get a complete reset to get that science back, so they don't get spun out. Because when you get spun out, right? You wake up in the morning, you're really calm. Next thing you know, you drink that cup of coffee and your mind's racing and you're on the treadmill again. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's just it's an endless cycle that I think is the science is so clear. That's the first domino. Then maybe the processed food and all the junk and the herbs and everything else you can do. But it's that stress that is really the first domino, really.
Yeah, and if we then look at that through the lens of cancer, what is one of the most destabilizing, rumination generating things we can ever encounter is when someone diagnoses you with cancer. Straight away you move from a place maybe of relative calm and happiness and groundedness, and suddenly you are in the storm. Your whole world turns upside down. This diagnosis consumes you probably every waking hour, and also when you're asleep in dreaming state, and then you wake up and the first thing you think about is, who's going to look after the kids? Am I going to die? What's chemotherapy going to be like? And what you find is, through no fault of anyone's, because the way the mind is wired, is that actually within a very few days of being diagnosed, suddenly your world has been upended in a way that's impacted every single aspect of your life. Your digestion's out of whack, you're not sleeping, you're tired, your immunity's dropping, your blood sugar regulation is impaired because of the sleep dysfunction, and nothing's actually changed. If you're diagnosed on a Monday, by Thursday nothing's really changed in your physiology. Cancer hasn't progressed in 72 hours, but you see this profound reduction in vitality and health and immune status and hormone balance and metabolic function within a week of diagnosis. And that's not cancer, that's the conscious response to cancer. And that response, as difficult as it is still under our control. It's, I think one of the things we maybe lost in the West, which one of my old mentors, who was a Sri Lankan Ayurvedic and homeopathic doctor, always emphasized, was that every stimuli we have, between stimuli and response, there's a gap, and in that gap there's choice, and in that choice you have complete freedom. Which is true in that you're diagnosed with cancer, and yes, it can feel overwhelming, it can feel like you've lost all control, but actually the majority of that situation you do have control over. And most importantly, you can control how you respond to it. And one of the books I always recommend people read, which has nothing to do with cancer, but it's everything to do with this, is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, who was an Austrian psychiatrist and psychotherapist who was put into the German camps, Auschwitz and Dachau, the concentration camps. And he ultimately said, I can't control being here. I can't free myself. But what I can do is I can free my mind. And he used it as a social experiment. Can I view the guards with kindness and gratitude? Can I be grateful for the fact that I have a bed, even though it's a concrete slab with 50 other people and it's -3? It's better than being outside in -10. And every situation he encountered, he looked at it through the lens of gratitude and possibility and optimism. And he lost less weight, he had less infections, and ultimately, there's always the potluck of being sent to the gas chambers. But aside from that, he maintained such a higher level of health and vitality. And his mission, his dharma, his burning passion when he got out of those camps was to propagate the message that whatever situation you find yourself in, particularly a health crisis, you can control the way your consciousness responds to that crisis. And in changing how you respond, you change the situation, you change the reality. And that 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 ability, yes, it's hard and it can feel overwhelming, but it is a choice. You could, hopefully you won't, but you could come on here and say this is a load of rubbish and start criticizing me. But it's my choice if I feel criticized or not. It's my choice if I feel a negative response to that. You could give me praise and say this was a great show, but it's my choice if I feel praised, if I feel happy. So we always have a choice between stimuli and response, and that is not just a psychological or an emotional tool. That's what healing is, that ability to create autonomy in the face of this crisis. Do I have the ability to take control of it? Yes, there's going to be good days, there's going to be bad days, there's days where I'm just going to sit in bed and cry and feel really down, and accepting that, and that's fine. But it's that ability to come out of that and say, right, I can engineer control over this, I can cultivate autonomy, and recognizing that in doing that, we move mountains in the direction of healing, because it's impacting upon ourselves, our physiology, right down to the way our cells and our genes are actually expressing. So this empowerment model, this autonomy model, is such an important message to propagate. And I think I feel one of the things, one of the cancer charities I'm working with in the UK is about almost providing free resources at the point of diagnosis, so that people get this information straight off the bat, rather than having to get it 6, 12, 18 months down the line, because it's harder to undo it than it is prevent it. So these tools, they're not small things. They have the ability to completely change the trajectory of what happens from the moment you're diagnosed onwards. These things, it changes the whole journey. And it's a journey that we have the ability to impact upon in a way that not I don't think is fully understood by a lot of people.
It's such an important point, and it is such a scary diagnosis. And I think a lot of people are so afraid of that diagnosis, they don't want to know. They don't get early detection. They don't go for scans and screens and things like that. And I think almost listening to what you said, that almost would motivate people like, I just want to continue live my happy life and practice in a preventative sense, because what if I go and I get diagnosed with cancer? Would my body, and this is a question for you, would my body be able to, is my body constantly healing cancer cells, and now it's a moving target, and I go there and they see a cancer cell that my body would have addressed in a month or two down the road, and now I'm going on for chemotherapy and radiation, which is sort of a massive stress for the body to undergo. Is there any truth to that idea? Obviously, is there any truth to the idea that obviously ignorance is bliss, but cancer is a pretty strong diagnosis? So how do you navigate those two things? Should I get all these diagnostics? And does the body heal itself from cancer on a regular basis? And is there this early detection on one hand life-saving, but on the other hand, creating more harm than good?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some cancers, obviously, where the research is unequivocal that early detection is immensely predictive of better outcomes. But at the same time, yeah, we know unequivocally, without question, that in adults, most adults will generate cancerous cells 3 times a year. That's the accepted stance, something called the surveillance theory. Which, even though it's not a theory now, we know that if you look at a human physiology over a 12-month period, the chances are that we will be producing cancerous cells on average 3 times, 3 individual cases of cancer every year, from the age of about 19 all the way through to our dying day. But most people don't get cancer. And if you get cancer at 60, it probably means you've had 40 years of having cancerous cells in your body. Well, what happens? You get cancerous cells, they start dividing. Your body is able to identify those. and mount a suitable immune response that destroys them. Then homeostasis is maintained, and then maybe 4 months later, another cancerous cell will develop, is identified, destroyed, and that cycle goes on for years, decades. But then at some point in time, whether it's because you're going through a bankruptcy or you're going through a divorce or you've got a job promotion and you're working much harder hours, it's not just those things, but something has to happen that means that at this point in time, an immune cell, a cancer cell is produced that the body and the immune system, for whatever reason, isn't capable of overcoming, suppressing, and destroying. And there's lots of question marks around why. Why it's someone who's diagnosed at 60, have they been so effective at destroying cancerous cells for 40 years, but not now? And there is an age implication. There is a suggestion that immune the rigorousness of our immune system drops as we age. And I personally don't buy into that, because I don't view 60, 70, 80s shouldn't be viewed as old. It shouldn't be viewed as a license for poorer physiological function. We know we can be in our seventh, eighth, ninth decade and have blood pressure and metabolic health and immune status that is aligned with a 50 or a 40-year-old. So there's an argument that it's age related, but the question, can the body identify and destroy cancer before it becomes a symptomatic burden? There's no question about that. We know we can do that. I could be doing it right now. I could have a cancer cell in my body that is that is proliferating, but in a month's time, it's not there anymore. There's no question. It's unequivocal. That's an accepted fact. The question is, how do we maintain the body's ability to do that and to extend it, so that actually, if we do get cancer, we're getting it in our ninth and 10th decade rather than our fourth, in 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, which is still young. But that's not to say that there are some situations where screening obviously is very, very beneficial. Cervical cancer is obviously probably the most famous example, but I think there is a dark side to that. And I think prostate cancer is probably the most famous example, where we know that actually, if you're having PSA tests done and you are asymptomatic and you're diagnosed with prostate cancer, 80% of the time you would have died with that prostate cancer rather than from it. But because you've diagnosed it, suddenly you're having prostatectomies, and suddenly you lost bowel function and you're impotent and your relationship suffers and you're incontinent and you can't do this and you can't do that and your masculinity is suffered and your mental well-being drops for something that 80% of the time you would never have known about. And suddenly your quality of life and your identity as a man is hugely impacted upon. So I'm not anti-screening. There are some situations where I think screening is incredible, and there's some contexts where it's very, very powerful and the evidence is very strong. But at the same time, we need to acknowledge how powerful our body is in naturally overcoming these kinds of mutant responses to cellular change.
So are you saying that that because your body is constantly fighting off these cancers, you could actually go there, your body's fighting off a cancer, you get diagnosed, and then in other situations besides prostate cancer, you could be going down a whole treatment protocol, radiation, chemotherapy, that in 6 months your body may have taken care of that? Is that a possibility?
I think it depends because if you're diagnosed because you're symptomatic, then the chances are that the cancer cells have
Right.
proliferated to a point where actually the burden is a lot more significant. Whereas the surveillance theory work is where the cells are still at a level where they're not causing symptoms. So once you're symptomatic and you're diagnosed with breast cancer, then does the body have the ability to overcome cancerous cells when they've reached that level of burden? And the current consensus is no, that is too much of an established pathology. But having said that, the whole arena of research around spontaneous remission, which is a rarer subset of the exceptional cancer survivorship work, does show, and again, this is unequivocal, this isn't my view or my opinion, there isn't one single cancer that someone with a stage 4 incurable prognosis hasn't gone into complete remission from. And that doesn't mean, the risk of that research is to say that everyone can achieve that, which unfortunately probably isn't the case. But what it does mean is that everyone has the potential to. And I, with every atom of my being, subscribe to the fact that every single cancer, irrespective of diagnosis or prognosis, can be overcome. Whether that's, if it's appropriate and suitable with the use of the best available conventional care, but that doesn't track from the body's own ability to heal. So, whether we're looking at this as an integrative model where we're using the best of all worlds, whether it's a situation actually where, well, I'm working with someone at the moment who's got incurable stage 4 esophageal cancer, and they're not having conventional treatment on the advice of their consultant because the side effects outweigh any benefit. It's not going to extend lifespan in any meaningful way. So why spend that 12 months in a very unwell state because of the chemotherapy? So in that context, it's an easier decision. All she's got available to her are the natural options. So I think it's very individualized. It's a very heterogeneous clinical situation. But I think one of the things we do need to open our eyes to, and it's something that perhaps the conventional medical model isn't so great at propagating, is just how powerful the human body is. And my view is that we will never create anything more effective at identifying and destroying cancer cells in the human immune system, because the whole field of immunotherapy is showing that immunotherapy is not adding anything into the body. It's just helping our immune cells identify cancer cells more effectively, removing the smoke and mirrors that cancer cells use to avoid immune detection. And there are so many things that we can do that mobilize immunity generally, but in a cancer specific way as well. Like the herbal medicine research is so compelling and so exciting. The dietary nutritional frameworks as well. So the question of can the human body mount a response that is capable of destroying and removing cancer, whether that's embryonically or whether it's in an established sense. There's no question there. The evidence is clear. It's just how do we mobilize that in the most evidence-based, most robust way. So I think that's a really important message, because a lot of people, I think, don't feel that's the case. They look at their body, particularly in cancer, and almost feel like they've been let down by it. They feel like their cells have turned against themselves, and it's this rampant self-destruction, which it can be viewed as. But actually recognizing how intelligent the body is, recognizing that inner intelligence that is the inherent part of every single body and every single cell, and recognizing that the immune system does and always will have the ability to identify and destroy cancer, and taking solace and taking motivation and inspiration from the exceptional cancer patient research to show that, okay, I'm living with stage 4 glioma, but there are people who have had stage 4 glioma who are alive 10 years later. They've done it. I can do it. How do I maximize my ability? How do I take that potentiality and make it my reality? And that comes down to a multitude of variables, but the belief that it can be done has to be the first one.
Wow. Um, I wrote an article many years ago linking the connection between ojas, which in Ayurveda is the kind of the physiological expression of consciousness and the driver of immunity, and melatonin. And I got criticized pretty heavily for making that connection. And I was surprised to see you making that connection in your book. I was like, okay, well, that's because somebody else is as crazy as I am. But when you actually do the research and you actually look at what ojas is in Ayurveda and what melatonin is, and the foods that have the highest amount of melatonin in them naturally, it's quite profound. And there's also, I did a podcast with a melatonin researcher, and she did studies on melatonin reversing breast cancer, preventing prostate cancer. The research on melatonin in cancer is off the charts, and it's scientifically documented. Now, here in America, you can buy melatonin in the grocery store. So, which isn't the best one to buy, by the way, because it's not always what you get on the label, just so you know. But the idea is that your doctor is never going to tell you anything about that here in this country, or talk about that profound research. And as we age, the science shows that nature's got a way of getting rid of us. We're not making babies anymore, so you're going to produce less melatonin, which is your most powerful anti-cancer, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory agent. And it protects you from DNA damage, which is one of the drivers of age-related chronic decline. So, tell us a little bit about some of the research that you know about cancer and melatonin.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? This marriage of ancient and modern. Because if we're thinking about ojas, like you just said, what is ojas? It's that longevity, immunity, vitality panacea, isn't it? In Ayurveda, and like you said, melatonin does drop off significantly after what 40, 45 years of age. But if we're using these approaches that boost ojas, or in Western parlance, boosting melatonin production, that ability to offset aging and offset the decline, the physical decline that comes with aging, is that such beautiful synergy between ancient and modern. And again, like you said, in the arena of cancer, it takes on another level of significance, because preventatively and interventionally, the links between melatonin and cancer biology is so strong. We think of melatonin as being this sleep hormone, which it obviously is, but the a lot of people, one of the researchers I used to work with, used to call melatonin the immune trigger. And they used to say the bullet is the immune system, but the pulling of the trigger is melatonin. And we look at that now. So many of the very, very specific anti-cancer pathways that the immune cells use to identify cancer cells, melatonin are informing those. They're pulling the strings to say, this is what this cancer cell might look like. This is its protein signature. This is how you identify it. So the having a robust immune system and doing things that cultivate a robust immune system is great. But if you haven't got the right melatonin profile, then that immune system is shackled. It can't do what it needs to do. So on the one hand, the melatonin, or what we would call OJAS, is incredibly important in terms of that anti-cancer immune pathway. But also then in terms of again, the circadian rhythm pathways, because melatonin, because it plays such an important role upon sleep synthesis, and sleep plays such an important role upon cancer, the body's response to cancer, is that if our melatonin is deficient or inadequate, and then sleep quality begins to diminish, that's going to impact upon energy pathways. It can impact upon digestive capacity the following day, particularly blood sugar. This is one of the areas that excites me the most, because if we look at cancer as being not exclusively but largely a metabolic disease, and we look at some of the metabolic risk factors, so IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor, which is one of the most sinister metabolic drivers of cancer. We know that in any given person with cancer, if their IGF levels are high, then the chances are their cancer growth, progression, and invasion will be significantly faster than someone with the same prognosis and the same diagnosis who has low IGF. IGF-1 follows insulin, which follows blood sugar. So if someone's diet is really good, and this is what's quite upsetting about it, someone might be moving mountains to adopt a really robust anti-cancer diet. But we know that after 2 nights broken sleep, if you get less than 6 hours sleep a night on 2 consecutive nights, and you look at metabolic profiling before that sleep disruption, a person could have absolutely normal, optimal blood sugar regulation and IGF status. 48 hours later, after intentionally disrupted sleep, they've moved into a pre-diabetic state. They are metabolically compromised, and their IGF levels are about 44 to 46% higher. So if you're living with cancer and you're going from a balanced metabolic state into a metabolic soup where your IGF is 40 to 50% higher, that's like pouring rocket fuel onto a fire. Suddenly, the cancer in your body has got so much energy to play with. It's got so much raw material to fuel growth and invasion. And that's not driven by your diet. It's not driven by sugar. It's driven by melatonin. It's driven by sleep synthesis. And if we are to minimize or mitigate that risk, we have to be sleeping properly. To sleep properly, what do we need? We need GABA and we need not just that, but primarily we need good GABA function and we need good melatonin. But melatonin is dependent upon what? Early morning sun exposure. The melatonin clock is typically a 14-hour clock that starts second we open our eyes and our eyes hit sunlight. So if we're waking up at 6 in the morning, then, by 10-ish, our melatonin, somewhere between, depending on our individual melatonin production rates, somewhere between 8 and 10, our melatonin is starting to be secreted, so that come 10:30, we're primed for sleep. But what I've seen a lot in the past, and some of the clinical research I did with ovarian cancer patients, because they're tired, they're sleeping until 10. So suddenly they're getting up at 10 and their melatonin clock is kicking in then, which means that their melatonin isn't primed until midnight, which means that actually they're not really primed for sleep until 1 in the morning. But by that point, the body's saying, well, I'm not asleep. I should be, because I'm a diurnal mammal. I shouldn't be awake at 1 in the morning. There's obviously a threat or a problem. Let's just release a little bit of cortisol just to make sure that if the saber-tooth tiger comes out, I'm awake. And then at that point, that night's sleep is pretty much eradicated. You might doze on and off, but you can't get good sleep. So it's almost like a top-down system, that melatonin is so integral to anti-cancer actions and metabolic cancer pathways. Sleep is dependent on melatonin, which is itself dependent upon that UVA, UVB trigger that comes in the morning. So we're spinning the plate and looking at it from different angles, but everything's saying the same thing, which is that our body is a unified model. And if we change one thing for better or for worse, a million and one other variables are going to change for better or for worse. So we have to look at healing, and have to look at health as this unified model where we have to be lining up all of these different variables in a way that makes the whole synergistically so overwhelmingly powerful in the direction of healing that disease hasn't got a chance. And that can look complex, I think, on the outside, but actually it's just honoring our inner wisdom. Our body knows what to do. It knows when to get up. It knows when to eat, knows when to go to bed. It knows when to exercise. It just had to listen. And that comes down to awareness again, which I know we've already discussed. But so it's this beautiful natural synergy, but it's about how do we mobilize that, I think, is the challenge.
Yeah. And that's why Ayurveda is such a cool understanding, because it's literally the original study of these beautiful ebbs and flows and cycles of nature, and how you can live in harmony with them or go against the grain against them, feeling like your life has become a struggle. And if your life feels like it's a struggle, you're exhausted at the end of the day, you're going upstream. You're not aligned with these natural rhythms. And there's a way to do that. When it comes to melatonin, I'm a huge fan, have been for years after I started doing research on Ayurvedic circadian rhythms, which is the dinacharya, the lifestyle, the seasonal cycles and all that. You can't not look at melatonin. And, there's a researcher, his name is Al Louie, who did research on low dose melatonin versus higher dosing of melatonin. And what I use with my patients who are over 50 is I suggest that they consider a microdosing of melatonin to just hack the aging process. Because melatonin, interestingly, is not, according to the researcher that I interviewed, Paula Witt, who's coming back on my podcast again for a second interview next month, actually. She told me that melatonin is not actually a hormone, because it doesn't actually suppress your own production. It actually encourages your natural production. So it's not a classic definition of a hormone.
Yeah. Oh, so
if we take, what's that? Go ahead.
That's interesting, isn't it? That actually it's not a hormone.
Right. It's a molecule. It's a 3 billion year old molecule. It's been around telling people winter's coming and nighttime's coming for billions of years. And if you were a microbe or a bug or an insect or a human or a mammal, and you didn't know winter was coming, you were going to be in big trouble. So for me, I take a very small amount of melatonin. I've been doing it for years, just to sort of hack the aging process and provide the antidote to the aging process. Where if someone had cancer, I would give them the clinical dose, which is a 3 milligram time release throughout the night, which is all the research on melatonin for cancer has been that 3 milligram dose. So I have 2 different versions that I'll give my patients, but I also have articles about where you can get the melatonin in your food, and just eat more of those melatonin-rich foods like pineapples, bananas, and goji berries, and even almonds. Many foods are really loaded, or tart cherries may be the highest. But there's ways to make sure that you hack that, because as you age, you're going to produce less. And the other thing that I'm sure you know, Russ Ryder, who was one of the original researchers of melatonin, he did a study and found that 90% of the melatonin that we produce in the body has nothing to do with your sleep, nothing to do with it. It's actually melatonin produced inside of your cell, produced by the infrared light from the sun that activates an enzyme called the cytochrome C oxidase enzyme that makes melatonin in your cell to swab up DNA damage from energy production. Whenever you make energy, you make waste, and that waste is actually very destructive to the body and one of the major causes of aging. But melatonin is what the body chose, and 90% of your melatonin in your body is inside your cells swabbing up all this free radical damage. And if you make less as you age, you're not going to swab that up as well. And therefore, you're going to degenerate faster. And however you're sort of genetically wired to break down, add in the stress, add in the pollution, add in the chemicals, and you may be more vulnerable to those kind of things, which is why I think melatonin at the right dose can be extremely preventative, and the research backs it. I was really happy to see you put that in there.
Yeah, I think again, it's one of those things that's just breaking through. I think in the UK, we're probably quite a lot behind maybe the research in the States, because it's not on the radar anywhere near as much as what I think it should be. It hasn't quite broken through into the public consciousness in the way other health hacks perhaps have. But I agree, it's that misconception that sleep, melatonin is purely about sleep, where actually it's a longevity tonic, isn't it? And the impact upon melatonin and, like you say, DNA repair pathways and things like that. And you look at some of the advanced who Brian Johnson, you may have come across Brian Johnson, the American billionaire who's trying to live to be 200, and he's investing millions and millions upon all these different biohacks. And one of the things he talks a lot of, some of the things are a bit out there, but lots of it is very scientifically driven and robust. And one of the things he talks about a lot is melatonin, exactly in that context of longevity, viewing melatonin. Yes, it's integral to sleep and this, that, and the other, but if we are to maintain cellular and DNA health into our 80s, 90s, and beyond, we cannot afford to be anything other than optimal in terms of our melatonin levels. And he's actually doing quite a lot of work to propagate that. So if you haven't looked at Brian Johnson's work, check it out. It's out there, but it makes a lot of sense.
And the beautiful thing about it is that because it encourages your natural production, what I'll give people is something called low dose melatonin, where one drop is zero point 0.1 milligram. I often take one drop per 5 nights, and then 2 drops for 5 nights, and then 3 drops for 5 nights, and increase that dose until they get a dose that gives them the benefit they're looking for. Deep sleep, waking up refreshed, not groggy in any way. And then what will happen, because melatonin at a higher dose, more than you need, can actually have a paradoxical effect, maybe not have you sleep as well. So when you actually start seeing a little bit of a disruption in your sleep, don't take more, which everybody thinks more is better. That's when you take less, because you've encouraged your own production. You have what you're taking and now making more of, so you can actually wean yourself back off of it and reset function. That's the beauty of it. It's not a drug where you got to take more and more and more and more of it. Actually, as you get more in line and you encourage natural production, you can actually take less, which is what makes it so beautiful as a way to kind of encourage your body's intelligence, as opposed to overruling it with a drug or something like that.
So clever, isn't it? So clever.
Yeah. You also
Incredible.
talked about some of the Ayurvedic herbs. Let's dive into that real quick before we could go on for hours. I think this is such a great topic. But there are some herbs, Ayurvedic herbs, that have some good research. Why don't you share some of that research?
Yeah, and this is another area that isn't breaking through perhaps into the consciousness as much as it should do. It's staying in academic medicine. Um, some of the most famous Ayurvedic herbs. I mean, turmeric is the celebrity pinup of anti-cancer herbal medicine. There's more herbal clinical trials looking at turmeric in the context of cancer than there is any other herb. But the evidence is so strong when we're looking at how turmeric and the constituent parts of it are able to suppress cancer cell biology. And herbs like ashwagandha is another incredible. And triphala, I think triphala is very much of the emerging herb. I think the impacts of triphala or triphala on anti-cancer pathways. So one of the areas they've looked at is these hallmarks of cancer, the main pathways that cancer uses to be cancer, the pathways that allow cancers to survive and progress and invade. And they've formulated that into these seven primary pathways, which are the main ways that cancer behaves. They've looked at the compounds found in herbs like astragalus and herbs like turmeric and ashwagandha and triphala, and what they're showing is these herbs are targeting five of the seven. Each herb is targeting five of these seven clinical pathways. And it's important to emphasize that some of that research has been done in rats and mice, so isn't necessarily directly translatable to humans. But when we look at the history of herbal research since 1980, about 75 to 86% of herbal trials that have shown a response in rodents translates to a corresponding response dose specific in humans. So particularly some of the most exciting research is the impacts of these kinds of herbs on a process called angiogenesis. It's generating really exciting work at the moment because um, if we're looking at cancer as this, localized cancer doesn't kill people. If we could contain cancer, it wouldn't be the threat that it is. 80% of all cancer deaths are caused by metastatic cancer, cancer that have invaded distant parts of the body. And if you pick up any given size tumor and put it into a rat, or we couldn't obviously do it ethically, we'll put it into a human, that tumor, no matter how established it is, as soon as you put it into a physiological being, will die very quickly through immune destruction and essentially starvation, unless it can pull in blood vessels to provide fuel, blood, and oxygen. And to do that, it has this incredibly refined process called angiogenesis, which is where essentially, if you imagine that the tumor is a magnet, and it pulls in these microscopic blood vessels that attaches to the tumor, that provides the nutrients and the insulin and the glucose rather, that allows it to grow. And that process is called angiogenesis. So anything that suppresses that is one of the most powerful mechanisms we have for reducing the risk of metastatic growth and actually suppressing the growth of established metastases. And lots of Western drugs like Avastin, are based upon suppressing or destroying angiogenesis. But the research around botanicals, certain foods like extra virgin olive oil, green tea, particularly herbs, like the research around the ability of turmeric to inhibit angiogenesis in human cancers, astragalus, incredibly strong, rhodiola. These are the research is robust. And to not be making use of these mechanisms as part of an integrative survivorship framework, to me, makes no sense at all. And one of the barriers to that problem, which I'm sure you've seen as well, is where we want to use a certain prescription of herbal medicines, but a consultant oncologist is essentially, well, I don't know much about it. I don't know the herb drug interactions. I'm concerned about the risks. I'm concerned around the interactions with chemotherapy. So I don't want you to use them. Um, and one of the great things, so the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in America, they have employed some very high level researchers to put together this immense resource, which there's a section for patients and there's a section for healthcare providers. And what it does is it lists all of these herbs, it lists the published evidence, and most importantly, it lists the herb drug interactions and the risks of things like chemotherapeutic interactions. And what it does for me, and one of the things I advocate in the book, is to say to people living with cancer, I would like to use herbs X, Y, and Z. Here's the evidence around why I would like to use them, because in people living with ovarian cancer, it showed this, that, and the other. Here is the research from the Memorial Sloan Kettering. Every consultant is going to know what that place is because it's so revered in global cancer research. And you can say, here is their perspective, here is their research, here is when it can and can't be used. Can you check this, and can you tell me if you're happy for me to use these herbs? So that resource has really removed one of the biggest barriers I think people living with cancer had around integrating herbs, because suddenly it's moved into that evidence-based realm. And the evidence is so strong. One of the questions I get asked all the time is, actually, is the evidence strong, or are you putting a gloss over this? But it is so strong. The evidence is so strong around the way herbal medicines and their constituent parts are able to mobilize the body's immune responses against cancer and suppress cancer cells' ability to do the things that allow it to progress and spread. So these herbs, that are so revered in traditional Chinese medicine, but also Ayurvedic medicine, the fact that they're really moving into the focus of Western cancer research, I think is really exciting, and it's needed, but it needs to be taken out of dusty medical journals, and it needs to be given to people on the ground who are living with cancer, so they can say, okay, these are the herbs I should be using. Here's why. Let's get them going in a safe and very transparent way.
Yeah, that is amazing. You also, in your book, wrote about the difference between using the whole plant and the extracts of plants. And let's just take turmeric, for example, curcumin, which is sort of the classic anti-cancer constituent, but it's one of 300 of the constituents in turmeric. And there are studies, I've written many articles about the difference between turmeric, as the whole plant, and curcumin as the extract. And while curcumin might actually been show to help reverse breast cancer and colon cancer, there's also studies showing that it actually can block stem cell production. It can actually do some harm. So it's sort of like when you take a plant and you take out one chemical out of it, and then you concentrate that, the body's not going to recognize that as natural. It's going to recognize it as foreign, and then there will be consequences or side effects as a result of that. And on herbs, which is why I'm a big fan of using whole herbs, is that there's what are called bacterial endophytes, which means that there's a natural microbiome on these plants. And the relationship between the plant and the microbiome is synergistic. And studies are now showing that the bugs on those plants, the bugs on the turmeric, are synergistic with all the 300 constituents in there. So when you take the whole plant, organic, with the natural microbiome, you actually, in study after study, have more of a potent and with less of the side effects than when you start taking the version of that plant that is the extracted, almost drug-like version, which may be the next medication, which are going to have benefit versus consequence, relationships, which you have to then weigh. Okay, I'm going to get this benefit, but I'm going to have this consequence, which we all see on TV when they have a drug commercial. You hear all the consequences. Well, the way you take natural herbs, they're like plants, they're like foods. You don't have those consequences in general, where you're actually getting more of the restoration of the intelligence of the plant, which supports the intelligence of us through our own inoculation of our own microbiome. Tell me a little bit more about what you've dug into that research. I love that you talked about that, because I feel like I'm an island in the world talking about that, and no one else seems to talk about the value of whole plants versus extracts, which are sterile.
Yeah.
Extracts are sterile.
Yeah, I just feel like it's what humans do, isn't it? It's so frustrating. We look at something that is great and we say, well, how do we isolate it and make it greater still? We don't need to reinvent the wheel with this. We don't need to take something that works and say, well, how do we magnify that response and make it even better? We just need to use what nature's given us. And nature's gifted us in plant medicine, in botanical medicine. It's gifted us this huge, huge array of healing herbs. And we just need to respect the way nature's given them to us. It's pre-packaged them into this immensely complex. I think never, I've worked in clinical herbal research for almost 2 decades in so many contexts, in primary care and antibiotic resistance and this, that, and the other. Um, every time I dive into a herb chemically and look at the constituents of a herb, it's like a Pandora's box. And you just see this overwhelming volume of individual parts that have, yes, a healing mechanism. But when you combine them into this synergy, the total gain is so overwhelmingly more powerful than the individual parts that make up that total. And if you're then looking at herb A that's got 250 chemically active constituent parts, and then you look at herb B that's got a similar amount, and herb C, and you combine all three of those together, not only have you got the individual parts of one herb synergistically working, then they're working synergistically with the other components of the other herbs. And suddenly you're getting a chemical response. It's almost like alchemy, where you're converting one thing into another thing. And it's not just, and this isn't esoteric, it's botany. It's not just the actual component parts that you could identify in a herb. The herb is a living thing. The herb has been alive, it's been in the ground, it's absorbed the sun's rays, it's absorbed nutrients, it has prana, it's a living entity. And certain herbs, in my belief, is that those herbs are on this earth because they're there to fulfill a healing objective. There are certain herbs, you look at herbs like andrographis, for example. That herb is or neem, some of the most revered herbs in Ayurveda. They are on this earth to help humans heal. It's not just why they're here, but it's their dharma, it's their purpose. And when we consume those herbs, yes, we get the identifiable medically active components, but we're also getting the energy of that herb. We're getting the actual its essence, its reason, and you can't always quantify that. And that's why I think often when you start using herbs properly, you see this healing response is often above what the research suggests, not because it's magic, because it's a multi-layered modality. It's got the botanical aspects, it's got the synergistic aspects, it's got the energetic aspects, it's got the pranic aspects. And when they all fuse together into a singular prescription, the impacts upon how that changes the workings of the body is overwhelming. Actually, I've got lab result after lab result, particularly of people who have finished chemotherapy, and they're if you no fault of their own, they're wrecked. Their immune system is wrecked. Their microbiome is wrecked. Their gut base, their secretory IgA, their gut immunity is on the floor. And then you get them aligned with the circadian cycle, you get them sleeping well, eating well, and then you add in these rebuilding, rejuvenating, synergistic herbs, and you see the lab results correlate with that. You see immune counts increasing, you see inflammatory scores coming down. You see, the gut, you see the microbiome profiles increasing, and it's not saying that herbs are a panacea for all ills. It's not saying that they can cure cancer. What they are saying is that the ability of these plant medicines to mobilize healing is, I think, often unappreciated, unrecognized, and we don't need to better them. They are perfect as they are. We need to use them as nature gave them to us, and if we do that properly, they are such all health, all prevention, all health. But in the arena of cancer, it's such a fascinating time to be involved in this research, because it's growing. There's probably been more funded clinical research into anti-cancer herbs in the last decade than there has been in the whole of history prior to that point, and it's only going one way. Every year it's exponentially increasing. So hopefully we're getting to a point where, rather than being viewed as an outlier or a complementary approach, what we're seeing is herbs integrated into the conventional care model. We're seeing that in Chinese hospitals, conventional Chinese hospitals. We know that if you have people with certain types of cancer, often lung cancers, having chemotherapy, and they're given astragalus at the same time, compared to people having the same chemotherapy without astragalus, they have less side effects, they have a better response to chemotherapy, they are discharged sooner, and it's also been shown to extend lifespan. So same match cohort, same chemotherapy, but the addition of a herb improves quantity and quality of life in a Western in a conventional medical hospital. And this is never going to regress. I just want it to move faster so that everyone going through these treatments can harness these benefits. So it's a hugely exciting time for this. Really exciting.
Wow. That is really, really incredible. And to that point, we have a formula called Turmeric Plus, which you know that when you add turmeric and black pepper, it explodes the absorption by like 2,000%. And that created the whole curcumin plus bioperine, which is the extract of black pepper and the extract of turmeric, and that became sort of a medicine in a way, and a very powerful one, and can be used as a medicine. But Ayurveda likes to use it more as encourage the body to do the job itself. And so we import herbs from India. They're all organic, and we got in the turmeric, and we have to check according to the FDA rules. We check the microbiome and identity and heavy metals and pesticides when they come in. Check the black pepper; it was all fine, and then we make the formula, and we mix them together. 16 parts turmeric, 1 part black pepper. That increases absorption by 2,000%. So you can do it at home. Take your turmeric 16:1 and sprinkle it on your food. Cook with it, whatever. And then we have to test it again for microbiome and identity, heavy metals. We just do another whole round of tests after we have the product complete. And my manufacturer calls me up and says, John, the microbes in this formula have exploded. Like the black pepper and the turmeric microbes, they got married, had babies, and they had a lot of babies. Now, they were still well within the legal limit of what's allowed as a microbiome. There were no bad bugs in there, but he goes, these are probiotics. This is not just true turmeric and black pepper anymore. This has become a probiotic. And that's the beauty of combined, like you said, when you put those herbs together in an intelligent way, which is why Ayurvedic wisdom is time tested. They've been doing this for thousands and thousands of years. If it didn't work, they would have stopped doing it. But because it did work, they continue to do it. And now we have the benefit of knowing that when you mix it 16:1, you get this sort of curry-like benefit where you mix it as a food, and you get the benefit of these herbs that create not only the chemistry of the turmeric and the chemistry of the black pepper and the absorption rate enhanced because of that chemistry, but you also get this explosion of an inoculation of a microbiome that's going to help eradicate many of the bad bugs that cause a lot of disruption in your body on many levels: immunity, circadian rhythms, inflammation, and so many levels. So there's a little example of what happens when you actually start to look at aligning yourself with as much natural and as natural things in the purest form as possible, whether it be your food, organic, so it's got a natural microbiome, your herbs. Sure, you can get an extract. It's sterile. It's going to probably work like a medicine. It can probably work really well, but it's not going to be encouraging your body to do the job for you. It'll be sort of doing the job for you in a natural way. And then the medications, the drugs are going to do the job for you any way that they can, because it's at all costs. Doesn't matter. We're going to help try to save your life. And they all have value, but it's nice to know where each of those stand,
Yeah, and even like the seed, what fascinates me as well is when the seasons that certain herbs come into harvest. Like where we are now in the UK, well, most of the Northern Hemisphere, obviously spring is here, Kapha time of the year, peaking, dandelions, nettles, cleavers, chickweeds, these intensely bitter herbs that are coming up now after, historically a long winter of preserved foods and dried meats and a lack of freshness. And suddenly we've got this abundance of free food, herbs, that are some of those powerful detoxifying, liver stimulating herbs in the world. And then you get to autumn and you've got your elderberries coming out, these powerful antiviral immune modulators coming into season just as cold and flu season is hitting. This intelligence, if you can see it, it's just everywhere. And it's, how do I harness this with the foods I'm eating, the amount of sleep I'm getting, the different exercise intensities between autumn and spring and summer, and this, that, and the other. And it's like you said, it's what I think Ayurveda makes Ayurveda so unique and so just mind-bogglingly important. It's just about understanding that intelligence and how we align our body's intelligence with the intelligence of the world around us. And if we unite them, I think the sky's the limit with what we can do when it comes to health optimization, longevity, disease prevention, disease management, the full gamut, really. It's such a fascinating, I find it so fascinating.
Absolutely. The book is The Ayurvedic Approach to Cancer by Dr. Sam Wass, who's a PhD researcher on cancer. I just can't, we just touched a little bit on what's in this book. This book has got so much information about what you can do to prevent. If you know someone who has got cancer, you really, really need to read this book, because there's so much that we can do. Like you said, change the mindset and have an arsenal of things that you can do to antidote and insulate yourself from the incoming, mindset that you are now you have cancer and all this is bad, bad, bad. And you need reinforcement to actually help you get the right mindset so you can actually amp up your immune system and change those underlying factors that may have got you into that, imbalance in the first place. Sam, this has been amazing. Other than the book, is there anything else that you want to share, like where people can get a hold of you, learn more, stay in touch with your research? How does that work?
Yeah, we've got an Instagram account which is Dr. Sam Watts. We share lots of free resources and recipes and herbal remedies, loads of stuff on there. So if you're looking for, tips and advice seasonally specific, we share every day on there. We've got a growing YouTube channel which is the same. So lots of information there. So yeah, we try to provide lots of information for free to help grow this movement really. So yeah, you can find us there.
You know, I've been doing this for a very, very long time. I wrote a book on seasonal eating. I prescribe my herbs seasonally. I talk about melatonin. I talk about whole herbs. I've not found anyone who, I feel like you're the UK version of me, and I love it because you're so much more brilliant because you're actually a researcher. I'm just sort of a practitioner and dig into the research for my patients, and write about the ancient wisdom of the modern science. But that's why I love this book, because if you like what we do here at LifeSpa, this book is in line with everything that I speak about, which is why I was so blown away to read it, because I'm rarely blown away by a book and the research and the ancient wisdom and the science that you talk about. And it's so in line with what I believe. And I think that's why a lot of folks follow us at LifeSpa, is because we talk about the ancient wisdom of modern science, how do we really reconnect ourselves with the natural rhythms of nature and how profound that can be for our health and well-being, our happiness, our joy, and of course, a long life. And we need a long life, not to live along a lot of numbers, but the idea is we need a long life to free ourselves from these old mental and emotional patterns of behavior, to evolve, to thin the veil of the physical and the spiritual, to gain the wisdom that we're really here to gain before we check out. Because we're going to all check out at some point, but there's so much to do in the second half of your life that we need to be in balance for and healthy for. And that's what Ayurveda really gives us the tools to, in your latter part of the second half of your life, is when you refine your nervous system, your self-awareness, your perception of subtle energy. And that can be the greatest time of your life. But in the West, it's just about, dodging diseases is the main thrust, which is just crazy, really, when you think about it, right?
Madness, and I know I'm digressing here, but it's so empowering, isn't it? This idea of countering the Western view of you get to 65, 70, you retire, and that's the end of your productive, meaningful, happy life, and saying, well, actually, get to 70, you should still have 20, 30 years of health and independence and vitality and excitement and vivaciousness and jumping out of bed, looking forward to the day rather than just thinking, well, what? I'm not working anymore. My kids have left home. Who am I? What am I? Because we associate that with a psychological outlook, but you can't delineate that from health. If we've lost our purpose, there's no reason we need to experience that decline in meaning and passion and purpose when we're 85 compared to when we're 45. And Ayurveda, not just Ayurveda, but it provides that framework for how we maintain that energy and that vitality and that vivaciousness for life that hopefully we will carry through to our dying day, which is, I think, probably a goal that both of us share for ourselves, but also helping other people achieve that and believe in it as much as possible.
Do you see a lot of people when they retire that's sort of the beginning of a downward spiral? Is that something that you've actually seen in your clinical research?
Yeah, massively. And also personally in family members. One family member had quite a big building construction company in London, retired early, moved down to the coast. Within 8 months, was clinically depressed, and has struggled with physical and emotional health ever since. And it happened so quickly and after retirement because all the meaning, the get up and go, the drive, the reason to get out of bed, the identity, all those things were taken away in a blink of an eye for a dream of early retirement that didn't provide anything that was fulfilling or meaningful. And I've seen that we ran a clinical trial into quite a big group of men with prostate cancer, and because it was quite a big London hospital, they were very successful people in terms of their careers and financially. And a number of men who said, retiring was the tipping point, one of the most significant tipping points of my life, because a year post retirement, I didn't know, I lost myself. I've heard so many men say, I've lost myself. I don't know who I am. I don't know what role I'm fulfilling here. My kids aren't at home anymore. I'm not working. I've got hobbies, but they don't really set me alight. And you see their health declining almost in front of you as the years and months and years go by, and it has to be protected against. We have to create this identity that isn't aligned with a set role. If we're just a dad or a mum or just a CEO of a company, all those things we can be taken away from us. We have to have an identity and a meaning that's bigger than those things. We can include them, but it needs to be more than that. And that's why one of the Ayurvedic concept of Dharma is something that is one of the biggest parts of my life personally, but also the things I try to teach is this idea that if you're living dharmically, you have that overwhelming sense of mission, it leads to a happier, more fulfilling, and usually more healthy life as well. So yeah, I think it's quite scary in many ways.
Wow, that's an incredible. I mean, I know we have to end. There's so much more to talk about, but that is such an incredible point to end on. It's just that passion, and as folks get older, if you're going to retire, that's one thing, but you better find something to replace it with, to give you, because, I don't see myself retiring because I love what I do, and I'm so blessed because I love researching and writing about ancient wisdom and modern science. But I tell you, as soon as you turn a certain age, like in this country, as soon as you turn, 60, when I turned 65, you start getting all this stuff in the mail. You're supposed to retire, retirement, da, 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 da. I mean, you get this, it's like a complete conditioning that you're over the hill, go to pasture and just get out of the way, And you really have to fight against it because it's just a mindset. I don't feel any different now than I did 20 years ago, maybe a little bit older, but I don't feel like, oh, I have to retire now. That's the message that you get. Oh, now you're supposed to just stop working and do what? You're like, what am I supposed to do if I don't work?
Yeah.
Am I supposed to be productive? I guess you're just supposed to not be productive and get old, And that's such a crazy, destructive mindset, right?
Yeah. So damaging and so unnecessary, so unneeded, and so misaligned, actually. It's damning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Sam, again, the book, The Ayurvedic Approach to Cancer, you got to read it. Everybody got to read this book, and let's stay in touch, and hopefully we'll have you back, and we can take another deeper dive into this because there's so much more to talk about. All right, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me on. I'm so grateful, and it's been a real pleasure. So thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Hi, everybody. I just want to take a minute and tell you what we do here at LifeSpa.com. I've been in practice now for 40 years, 38 of them have been practicing Ayurvedic medicine full-time. For the last 20 years, I've been writing articles and doing videos on the ancient medical wisdom of Ayurveda with the modern science. If something's been around for 1,000 years, still practiced today, and you have modern science to prove it, boy, I really feel like that's something we should all be taking a look at. And that's what we do at lifespa.com, and all that information is for free. So just go to lifespa.com and search in your health topic, and you'll get the information, the article that you need, hopefully that will help you. While you're there, check out our Ayurvedic store. You can get there through lifespa.com or go to store.lifespa.com. And there we have all of our organic Ayurvedic herbs, organic skincare line, more books, tapes, knowledge that we give you is all there at our store. All of our cleansing kits are there in our store. All of our herbs are whole herbs with the natural occurring microbiome, the way it came out of the soil. And that's critically important because if I took the bugs out of you, you'd be completely different. We take the bugs away from a plant, like sterilizing and making an extract or spraying your food with pesticides, you lose significant benefit of that plant. And that's why we use the whole plant with the natural occurring microbiome. So check us out, learn more about what we're doing here at lifespa.com, and we'll see you again.
This recording is brought to you by LifeSpa, where ancient Ayurvedic wisdom meets modern science. Get access to free health video newsletters by Dr. John at lifespa.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.